Let me just quickly introduce myself. I'm Simon Hills, co-chair of Child Labour Task Force, part of the Alliance for the Protection of Children in Emergencies, along with Lotte Claessens, who I think has also joined. Many thanks to Stefano and the team from EAPEC for reaching out to us as well. They sent an email about a month ago saying they wanted to share a presentation and explain the work that they were doing in Ethiopia, DRC and CAR, and so wondered if they could piggyback off the back of the task force to share with members and to share the information with others, and also get some information as well, I think, themselves of other actors working within these three countries.
I'm Naomi Hall-Opio. I'm the Programme Manager for the EAPEC programme, which stands for Effective Approaches to Eliminate the Worst Forms of Child Labour. This is a DFID-funded programme through the UK Aid Connect funding stream, and this is the only programme that DFID are funding under that work stream, specifically on child labour and modern slavery. And the idea of the programme is to test and measure innovative approaches to understand what works in reducing the worst forms of child labour specifically in fragile contexts. And so it's the first of its kind that brings together a consortium of international NGOs, local partners, private sector, a well-renowned university, corporate foundation and media development agency to specifically look at tackling supply and demand issues which result in child labour in fragile states. There's also an evidence gap related to studies on worst forms of child labour. So this programme specifically focused on those children forcibly recruited into armed conflict, used in prostitution, forced labour and hazardous work. And that's narrowed down again when we get into each of the different country focus. And we are looking at the particular challenges of programming in fragile states through an adaptive programme focused on testing interventions at a small scale before analysing their effectiveness, adapting as necessary, and then scaling them up or replicating to the other contexts. All UK Aid Connect programmes are focused on these specific Aid Connect priorities and DFID learning priorities. Even though we're the only one in the child labour and modern slavery theme, they all follow these same priorities. So that's how we have designed the programme, and they all follow a 9-month co-creation period. We started this programme back in October 2018, but with a 9-month co-creation phase, which meant that as a consortium, we had that 9 months to really further develop our proposal into a design, ensuring that we're engaging with our country officers and doing some initial research and really making sure that we've got a design that we feel is going to be effective, and having the opportunity to adjust the budget and the meal framework and everything necessary that normally happens with that big lag between a proposal being submitted and then a programme starting. So in terms of the partners in the consortium, so I'm from World Vision UK and we're the global lead for the programme. And then our country officers in CAR, DRC and Ethiopia implementing on the ground, and then War Child also implementing in CAR and DRC. Then we've got Thomson Reuters Foundation, which is supporting us with some of the legal engagement pieces on the media side. So that's both in terms of strengthening media coverage in country and globally, and also some links with the private sector, and they're supporting the creation of a knowledge management platform, which will have internal and external facing components. So we'll be able to share with you at a later date the external public facing website, which is where we'll be keeping a lot of information on the programme and other information regarding child labour. And then we've got Columbia University, who will be sharing a bit about their approach to the research shortly. And 58, a UK focused consultancy who are our technical advisor in supply chains, and UN Global Compact Network, who are focused on our private sector engagement piece, particularly at the global level, but also through their learning network in the DRC as well. Then also looking at various other partnerships throughout the project. And it's a 4-year project but really sort of 3 years once we take off the co-creation period and the initial start to implementation. So we've just started year 2. So yeah, the 3 areas where the program's being implemented: Central African Republic, so obviously very much focused on fragile contexts with Central African Republic, DRC, specifically focused in the east, where War Child is implementing in Masisi in North Kivu, and World Vision in Zabira in South Kivu, and then also implementing in Ethiopia in Amhara, so less fragile, although still, particularly in this last year, there has been quite a lot of fragility in that area, but it also enables us to do a little bit more in Ethiopia to get more evidence, because this situation is a bit more stable, and we can use that to compare and contrast. So through this approach, DFID wants us to learn what's possible in terms of reducing the worst forms of child labour by testing different approaches and learning between the different countries that we're implementing this in, and between the different organisations and the slightly different approaches that we're taking to programme implementation. This is our theory of change. I'm not going to go through it in any detail, that would take a very long time, but just for those who are interested in this type of thing. And just to sort of really highlight, obviously this is such a complex area, there's so many interlinkages. This is just a snapshot, but we recognise there's so many other aspects which are all interlinked. We also recognise this is a very ambitious programme, and there's also other cross-cutting elements as well that are part of it. But really, we're focused on child protection system strengthening in contexts where they're very weak, particularly in DRC and in CAR, and looking at the different levels where we can focus on improvements, whether it be at national level or more local levels through local organisations, local community-based coalitions, and through that, even through local bylaws, and through that try and make a step change. So everything's very interconnected and includes advocating for better practices, whether that be in terms of parenting, in terms of cultural practices regarding early marriage and education, or private sector behaviour itself. And there's a big focus on evidence and filling and ensuring that we can fill some of the evidence gaps. So we have 4 outcomes for the programme. The first one is focused on girls and boys exercising their agency, understand their rights not to be exploited, which is affirmed by positive social norms, supportive families and communities. This is based on existing research that has taken place regarding the importance of positive social norms and the effect of negative social norms, and ensuring that girls and boys themselves are centre of the programme, and ensuring that using an empowerment approach. To recognise that without any alternatives to worst forms of child labour, we're not going to make a difference to the household poverty and that sense that children must work to contribute to household income. So there is a component of looking at alternatives, whether that be economic alternatives through livelihood support, income generation activities, and other savings and loans groups, or through non-economic activities such as returning to school and other vocational training options. The third outcome is focused on a stronger legal and policy environment in order to prevent and reduce worst forms of child labour. This is largely led by Thomson Reuters Foundation, with also linkages to the work that War Child and World Vision are doing at community level. And then finally, we're looking at the private sector strengthening their value chains to reduce and prevent the worst forms of child labour. So really, we're focusing in on certain key supply chains in the countries that we're working with, which is sesame in Ethiopia, and gold and cobalt in DRC and CAR, in order to look at mapping those supply supply chains from where it is produced and then going upwards, which is quite an innovative way of doing value chain mapping. Normally it's done from the consumer down, and looking at how we can work with the private sector to reduce child labour in those supply chains, and really seeing where it is and what can make a difference, with also at the same time engaging with global businesses as well. I will hand over to Mark now, who is going to take us through the research component led by Columbia.
Thank you, Naomi. And I'm going to try my very best to do this in 10 minutes, which will mean I will leave a lot to the slides. We will make sure that the slides are available to you afterwards to review, and we'll also share the contacts of our key people with you to follow up with if you're interested in learning more about specific pieces of this. This slide we can go over very quickly. We are the Care and Protection of Children Learning Network at Columbia University. We know many of you who are members of the Alliance, as we co-chair the Assessment, Measurement, and Evidence Working Group of that. And essentially, we are a 15-year-old research network that seeks to bolster the evidence on child well-being. We began in humanitarian settings and have over the years begun to bridge work in humanitarian settings with longer-term work. Another core feature of our work is that we work in partnership with national research institutes. The 6 core ones that we work with are listed there. And for example, over the course of this project, we've been developing a very nice partnership with the University of Gondar in the Amhara region of Ethiopia, and hope to do the same with the University of Bangui in the Central African Republic, and potentially some Congolese universities as well. So our role in the EAPEC program really is to guide and to lead on the evaluation and measurement components of it, is specifically evaluating the programs as they happen. This is, as Naomi mentioned, these are extremely challenging contexts that we're working in, and simply understanding how the program is interacting with these contexts is important. And the program has already needed to shift quite a bit as it's gotten developed, and I think we would all be surprised if there weren't additional changes as the program is implemented over 3 years. Key feature of being able to do this well is to develop valid measurement tools. And those of you who are on a child labor working group will not be surprised to know that the measurement of child labor, and within that the worst forms of child labor, is very much still a work in progress. One of the early pieces of work that we did during the design phase that Naomi mentioned was a review of all of the ways that child labor and the worst forms of child labor can be measured. And we did this in collaboration with somebody who had been the child labor measurement focal point at UNICEF headquarters for a number of years. And we're quite surprised that it's a much more fluid area of measurement than we suspected, and that it's still evolving our understanding of how to measure child labor. So we will be doing our best job possible given the current state of measurement, and also hopefully trying to develop some new tools as the project progresses that we can contribute to the field as well. Our number one question in the research and the evidence is a program evaluation in at least 2 of the countries that is asking the question, what about these programs is making them effective or not effective in preventing and reducing the worst forms of child labor in the program sites? And so that is the core research goal. And then we'll get into some of the other questions in the next slides. The themes of our research work are, I've already reviewed measurement and how we measure child labor accurately. Social norms is another piece that we've been digging into, both the norms that exist in communities among parents and caregivers, and also broader community members who may have the potential to impact on child labor. We've also decided to explore the extent to which there are social norms that work within companies and the supply chains that Naomi referred to. And to do that we've begun already working with doing some focus groups with the corporate social responsibility representatives of some companies who are members of the UN Global Compact that Naomi referred to. And now as 58 undertakes its supply chain mappings, we will be working with them to integrate social norms related questions in their own interview guides. When I say social norms related questions, this is not just about people's attitudes and beliefs about child labor, but also what they believe others in their reference group. So other private sector representatives that are their peers or even their competitors. What do these people believe those people are saying, doing, thinking around the worst forms of child labor? We will be measuring the impact of worst forms of child labor on child health and development. And specifically, we won't be doing biometric measurements, but we will be looking at especially psychosocial well-being and mental health development, as well as more standard child development measures. And then finally, we will be able to, in some of the research settings, tease out the differentiation of the impact on individuals and then those people who participate in the broader community level interventions but may not have the individuated interventions. Really done quite a few systematic reviews of the backgrounds on this, coming from various fields like economics, public health, social anthropology, sociology as well. Naomi has referred to the evidence gaps we're trying to fill, and these are, I would say in a word, quite large. We know very little about the effective approaches to ending child labor, and especially these worst forms of child labor that are more dire violations of children's rights and forms of labor that we know children should be removed from. So in terms of child labor measurement, I will try to spend just 1 minute each on these slides because each of these has a literature review behind it that we would be happy to share. Essentially, the existing measures, there are some, they're really at the phase of being tested. The ILO has been very instrumental in this, so Simon would know a lot about it, but there's still quite a lot to learn as well. So the challenges that we face when trying to do these measurements are whether or not you engage with children or adults. You often get different answers from both of those groups, but we suspect the information's more accurate from children, but of course then there are quite serious ethical considerations to bring in. Various measures use different reference periods for when the work was undertaken. Only longitudinal studies can help you with the causal analysis, and there have not been many of those. And then understanding risk and hazard in context is something that we hope to be able to contribute to as we move forward on this. The last point I'll make before turning to the next slide is that the worst forms of child labor definition does include harm to the health, safety, or morals of children. And that concept of morality is something that is difficult to unpack. The social norms in the private sector, I think we can simply say in our lit review, we asked, has anyone been looking at how individuals working in the private sector are considering the actions of their peers as influencing factors? Are there normative factors and elements at play? And it was a very clear and straightforward no when we had done the lit review and looked at 2 different bodies of literature related to this. Although there is some writing on corporate social accountability and what companies are trying to do, the ways that individuals are within companies understand the actions of their peers and how that should influence their own actions is quite new. So we're looking forward to better understanding how people believe that the collective of the private sector is or isn't influencing their own decisions. The final is that given that a large amount of the community level work on this program is around community awareness raising campaigns, we did a lit review on what we know about what works and what doesn't work there. And not specific to child labor, but across a range of health and development issues. Certainly there is evidence that these kinds of interventions can work. simply to provide information, to change cultural beliefs. Edutainment programs seem to have good outcomes. Those looking at media interventions in conflict settings would note that, of course, the information and communications platforms are neutral, and that the messages themselves can contribute to either appeasing the conflict and fostering peace, or actually fueling the conflict. And so we need to be careful about the messages as we design them. And then finally, social norms is an area where you can shift what people believe about their collective through these information campaigns. So we shared the findings of these with the program teams in the hopes that those will be useful to them as they design their community level intervention. As we approach the evaluation, two pieces have been central here. One is modularity. The programs really have a lot of components to them. We are trying to design the evaluations in a way where we are able to evaluate the impact of as many modules or components of the program as possible. That hasn't been as easy as we hope, but we certainly are still aiming to be able to measure as many of these modules as possible. One piece of that is that we are spending the first year of the implementation testing and measuring the new and innovative components of the programs. And these vary from country to country. And each country program has decided which of its programs it would like to evaluate as pilots. And in some countries, these are parenting programs. In others, they are school feeding programs. In yet others, it is broader empowerment and social norms change programs. So depending on the country, we have a set of 4 to 5 pilot testing laboratories that have recently launched and that we are accompanying through a process of systematic evaluation. And then in 2 of the 3 countries, we will have mixed methods outcome evaluations that will include either experimental or quasi-experimental designs. The objectives from we share objectives for these pilot tests that I've just run through that are running for 6 to 9 months. In some countries, they've started in a few places and will really be started everywhere by January. So we're really at the outset here, is to understand, in scientific terms, we would talk about feasibility and acceptability. This really is to understand if the pilots that have been proposed or the programs that have been proposed are going to be possible in the area, if they're going to show promise for the kinds of outcomes that we are hoping to do, and if they are going to be cost effective, or if in reality they're going to be extremely expensive and might not be the most cost effective way to reach the outcomes that we hope. The 3, I mentioned systematic accompaniment. The 3 tools that we will be using are participant observation. So the research team members are embedded within the program teams as they do this, and they are observing and taking very clear notes of the processes as they occur, interviews and group discussions with a variety of stakeholders, and then pre and post questionnaires, mostly on knowledge attitudes practice for the pilot participants. The outcome evaluations will have baseline and endline, hopefully with control groups. Certainly in Ethiopia, we will have that. We are looking to design that in the Democratic Republic of Congo as well, and are looking at ways to do this in Central African Republic. Essentially, we will look at the impact and the outcome that the program has had after 2 years. So we will run these in March, April in Ethiopia, later in the summer in DRC, TBD in CAR, and then the program will run for 2 years and will repeat at the end. And then we will be able to determine the extent to which child labor has reduced in these program sites. One thing that I would add is that by doing this with control communities and at population level, we won't simply capture the impact on beneficiaries, but we will know if child labor overall has reduced because of the program and the project site. So that's an important and interesting addition here.
The program's aligned with child protection minimum standards. It's very much framed and designed within a child protection systems approach. and particularly around Standard 12 on child labour. And many of the different elements are also included in our programme design. I'm the programme manager and not the technical advisor for the programme. So our senior child protection advisor, Amy Gabriel, is unfortunately on leave this week, but she is also quite happy. She has had some involvement with the task force. She's quite happy to take questions as well, that we can pass on to her if there's anything we can't answer. The first outcome is all around that boys and girls exercise their agency and understand their rights not to be exploited, affirmed by social norms, supportive families and communities. Through this, we're really working with communities so that boys and girls understand knowledges of their rights and skills not to be exploited, and then that households and caregivers also understand rights of children, particularly related to worst forms of child labour and recruitment into armed groups. And that's also clear, and that then the wider communities also understand those laws and those rights, and that we're enhancing their knowledge and skills in order to protect children. So that we're looking at all the different levels, and then also working to support the strengthening of those social structures and creating a more safe social environment. So some of the activities that we will be doing to achieve these, they look slightly different in each context. They've all gone through a long process of contextualization, and we had design workshops in each country and bringing together many different stakeholders in order to make sure that we've got design that's focusing on the right stakeholders for that particular year, and really working on activities that they feel could be influenced to make a difference. So some of those activities include child-led local level advocacy, various different forms of community dialogue, awareness raising at different levels, and promoting positive norms, supporting child clubs and child parliaments. And then we'll have some listener groups, which will basically be formed of young people that will be listening to some of the radio broadcasts that will be compiled through the programme to actually, and then to discuss them, so that then we also get feedback from them on how they found those radio broadcasts, anything that they felt need to be improved, and also to enable sharing of experiences as well. There'll also be community theatre and strengthening those community-based protection mechanisms that already exist, such as RICOPEs in DRC and CAR. Then the third outcome, Stefano will talk about 2 and 4, is focused on the legal and policy environment to support those changes at community level. And this will be largely led by Thomson Reuters Foundation, as I mentioned, and with support from War Child and World Vision at the local level. And through this, we're really trying to build coalitions of various different stakeholders who will be working together within their area of strength to support, whether it's the existing national plan of actions around child labour, for example in Ethiopia where that exists, or helping to create momentum towards one being created, such as in DRC and CAR, or at least the sort of initial steps to sort of start moving towards national plan of actions for child labour. Then sharing information on the legal environment and services to raise awareness, and strengthening the capacity of duty bearers at various different levels, whether that's labour inspectors or police or judiciary, wherever it's been felt that there is a potential to have capacity building at those different levels. And then, of course, child protection reporting and referral mechanisms, so looking at what those existing mechanisms are, where some of the capacity gaps are, and where the programme can support strengthening those. So these different activities will take place at the local, the national and the provincial level, recognising that many of these structures are very weak, and working within what is possible within that environment, but still maintaining our ambition to bring about change. Over to you, Stefano.
We can move to outcome 2, that is focusing on identifying alternatives and supporting alternatives to the worst forms of child labor. These activities under this outcome involves identifying education opportunities as one of the possible alternative pathways to worst forms of child labor, and support the children to access education, improving the quality of the education that is provided in the targeted school, the establishment of a system to provide school meals. Furthermore, a foundational activity under this outcome is labor market and value chain assessments. That is a joint effort between World Child, World Vision, as well as 58. So it is a shared activity, and we are currently coordinating on that. And then outcome 2 also involves an economic strengthening component through Village Savings and Loan Association, providing business development support and other services through hubs that will be created to improve the local labor market efficiency, connecting people that we are working with existing opportunities, or supporting them to create new opportunities for micro entrepreneurship, while at the same time engaging with the local private sector to make sure that they can also find people with the right kind of skills. Outcome 2 is connected with outcome 4, that is the next one, and is one of the innovative aspects of project, because these two outcomes have to collaborate in linking the targeted population with private sector actors active in the area. So outcome 4 has several activities at engaging and supporting the private sector and business networks to identify and share best practices to prevent and reduce the worst forms of child labor. Of course, private sector will be engaged in mapping the value chains, as well as in understanding and documenting how the informal sector fits into the formal supply chain. So we're not only looking at the formal supply chain of these global commodities, but we'll also look at the informal economy that revolves around them. A strong aspect will be also analyzing the corporate norms that influence the ability by company to address forms of child labor. And of course, we'll be, in the first year of the project, we'll be testing context-specific interventions, aiming at improving the enabling environment for the private sector and supporting the reduction and prevention of the worst forms of child labor. So both these outcomes really complement each other and will be led in terms of implementation in the country by World Vision and World Child, but in strong collaboration with 58 and the United Nations Global Compact Network. I think that with this slide, we can conclude the presentation. If any of the participants have questions to ask, now is the time for questions and answers.
I'm Dan Collis, and I'm the Programs Director at War Child. Thank you, all the colleagues, for these inputs. And it's a project, of course, that we know a lot about because we're part of the consortium. But I was really pleased to dial into the call today because I shared with some colleagues here in London an article that's in the paper this morning in The Guardian, which is about cobalt mining in southern DRC, near Lubumbashi, southeastern DRC. And it's really shocking. There's issues that we're all familiar with, but it's good coverage. And it's about the exploitation of children in artisanal cobalt mining and the links of that with lithium batteries and all of the gadgets that we use in our lives. But the dangers that children face in that activity, and dreadful stories of kids being buried alive and that sort of thing. And I suppose it's a question for Stefano, but maybe any of the other members of the team more closely involved in the project. If we were to think about those individual children in those conditions undertaking hazardous cobalt mining in southeastern DRC, what might look different for them in a couple of years' time? I think we can all understand, the need to map value chains and the need to present alternatives around either access to education or less hazardous labor. But it's not easy actually to present those alternatives. If it was, I guess those children wouldn't be doing that activity in the first place. So I would just be really interesting if an example of one of the pilot activities that might tackle that particular problem could be drawn for us.
Thanks, Dan. This is Naomi from World Vision. I will try and answer, and thanks for highlighting that. I look forward to reading that article, and seems like there's more and more of these kind of stories coming out. So look forward to looking into that. From my perspective as the program manager, I would say what the difference we would see is that in these mines we would have less children working in them, in an environment where the community understands the specific risks faced by children if they are to work in those kind of environment, the risk to their health and the risk to not being in education, that there's a sense that the mines are a form of local livelihoods. We don't want the mines to close down. We don't want the communities believing that that's what some of these interventions want to do, but that the place for children is in school, being able to play and help with household activities, but without being in those sort of exploitive environments. That to me would be a good outcome.
Dan, this is Mark, and I actually have done research in that specific region of Congo, and I think it's an interesting example. That's because the mines really govern life there, and they're the only economic livelihood available to the overwhelming majority of the population. So I would think that the creation of some alternative economic opportunities for families would be a huge piece of this, reinvigorating the agricultural sector in an area that imports every tomato and pepper that you buy in the region is imported from Zambia just across the border. So I think that the link to some of the agricultural alternatives are there, but also, as Naomi just said, the making sure that it's known that children's places in school, education are quite a bit lower in these regions that are so dominated by the mines. And that all it's normative at community level, but there also needs to be a real shift in the way that the decision makers and leaders are thinking about this. And there is the mapping of the supply chain. One thing we already know in Congo is that it's going to reveal, that certain people are benefiting from this situation as it is, and that some of those are going to be politically well-connected people. So I think we'll have some risks that emerge for consortium members as we learn more about the nature of these supply chains that will make us take some very difficult decisions about access to project sites versus exposure of the things that we're learning.
Any other questions from anyone on the call?
This is Lorenzo Guarcello from ILO. I'm from the Research and Evaluation Unit, Fundamentals, Principle and Rights at Work branch in Geneva. It's not a question, but it's more something that is of interest, at least for me personally, but here also for the group, in regard to the child labor measurement, and also the causal link between the worst form of child labor and the health of children. For the child labor measurement, we have done lots of work on this side, and we are doing now additional work because of the recent change in the definition of child labor, at least now, in how child labor is measured, given the 20th CLS, this International Conference of Labor Statisticians of last October. But now what was called employment in the past is actually now the term employment relate only to those looking for pay or profit. There is this new concept of forms of work. So something to be careful while designing the questionnaire and the type of question, to be sure to capture the right form of child labor. Of course, the worst form of child labor are different, and so different types of form of child labor, what form of child labor you're going to capture. So there are different, of course, methodologies and ways to capture them. Given our interest, and given that Simon is there also in the circle, is more of offering some help or suggestion. So it's, I mean, it's, as I said, a personal interest, but also if you have questions, we will be happy to help. And then a curiosity on the causal link on the worst form of child labor and health. Do you have already an idea of the methodology you are going to use? Because as we know, I mean, the link of these two is very much dynamic. So sometimes it's difficult to measure. Where, there are studies, but of course they use longitudinal data. So we are also struggling to see how to measure this link, not only with the worst form, but with child labor in general. Thank you.
Thank you, Lorenzo. Mark, is there anything that you want to say to respond?
Only to thank Lorenzo for the offer of technical support. And yes, we would be happy to just share how we're approaching this in more detail. You see Cecile's email address there. She's the one actually leading on the tool design, although there is a team of us working on it. This would be a great moment for us to check in and to get your feedback on those. So thank you.
Perfect. That's very nice. No, thank you.
There was a meeting the other week I attended and met someone else from EAPEC, and so I put them in touch with our project on the ground, I believe, with Jose, who's working on mining in East DRC.
Excellent.
First, thank you for the presentation you are presenting to us, but I would like to raise some points, which is very important from our experience. First, my name is Noor Salah. I am from Palestine, Islamic Relief Palestine. I am working as Education and Protection Senior Coordinator in Gaza Strip. We really appreciate this type of research, and from our experience, we are conducting some projects and some contribution of research in such kind of child protection concern like child protection. I do really appreciate if this research make a correlation between the child labor and abuse and the protection risk that the child is facing during his or her labor. The second one, because there is a correlation, I think, theoretically at least, the child labor with the general well-being of the children. So what's the significant relationship between child labor and well-being? The third one, if the researcher found will find a child work with his or her parent after school hours, this will be considered in this research as a child labor, unless this work doesn't affect on his education, because it's a very important issue, because according to the child safeguarding policies over the world, if the child can't bear at the level of the physical power, I think this is contradict with the child protection. So I don't know if it will be considered in the research or not. And what's the percentage of the children who are working and who left the education system? These are generally the points that I have to raise regarding to this significant research that you are talking about. Thank you.
Sure, I think those are all excellent points, Noor. And within the broader category of children's work, then you, of course, you have the child labor, which is exploitive, and then you have the worst forms of child labor. So the way that we have, and all of these are extremely difficult to measure. So we're doing the best that we can with the tools available at this point in December 2019, and we'll try, to innovate some as well. But we would certainly want our results to be able to differentiate those different levels. Another piece that we've incorporated is first step called ethnographic interviewing, where we actually have been asking community members. We've started in Ethiopia. We'll do the same early next year in Congo to share their own beliefs in that particular setting about at what point labor becomes exploitive and what is safe work for children and what is not safe work for children. And your point about school attendance is a very major one. And so the short answer is yes, we will be using the data to differentiate all of these. The longer answer that I think would need, we could actually do a whole webinar just on these different levels of work, labor, and worse forms of child labor, and the link between each of them in school and well-being. And that's why I mentioned early at the beginning of my presentation that this is all still a fluid and evolving field. We're just happy to be able to contribute something, we hope, that is solid and that is going to be able to provide a concrete example of.
Thanks to everyone for joining in, listening, and thanks to all of you for presenting this project. I think there's been a lot of interest in it, and it is interesting moving forward. Just to conclude as well, for the members of task force going forward, if you have other projects similar to this or interesting that you want to share, do let me and Lotte know, and we're more than happy to look at how we take these requests on board and see if we can share it with the members. I think it's a good way of sharing knowledge, projects, and seeing where we can overlap and add value as the task force to some of this work as well.